Welcome to Jewish Cinémathèque, where we meet some of the important faces involved with films that tackle aspects of the Jewish experience. Today I am joined by documentarian Laura Bialis, whose cinematic study of Roman Vishniac is being shown as part of the New York Jewish Film Festival, presented by the Jewish Museum and Film at Lincoln Center. Vishniac was a controversial figure in that he was known to be a self-promoter, quite difficult, sometimes a manipulator of the truth, but a master of reinvention. He was also an incredibly brilliant photographer whose photographs of Eastern European Jewry before World War II capture a life that was quickly eradicated.
I remember many of his pictures being born in the darkroom, and this feeling of closeness to my father. I would ask him about the people in the pictures, and he would say, "These are our people."
In those terrible days just before Hitler struck, Dr. Vishniac was there with his camera.
At the time that he was taking those photographs, nobody knew the Holocaust was coming.
These were people in a way of life that was wiped out by the Nazis.
Documentary photography was in the process of being invented. Mobile with small cameras, trying to catch life on the fly, the surrealism of life, the poetry of life. You were not documenting the world in a neutral way. You were documenting the world in order to change it.
Words could be later mistrusted. The images would serve as witnesses.
We had gotten passage for 4 of us on the last trip to leave from Lisbon. I have a memory of looking out and feeling a tremendous sadness.
Roman did portrait photography, anything he could to make a living at the time.
He had enormous chutzpah. Invited Eleanor Roosevelt to see his show. He regarded himself as a mixture of Moses and Superman.
A preeminent photographer of East European Jews. They were exhibited as a kind of eulogy to a lost world.
He used to say, the closer you come, the more beautiful it is.
A child must get knowledge for himself. This is the only true, valuable approach to the science of life.
Laura's work includes her 1999 Talk for Alt, Survival of a Human Spirit, about Holocaust survivor Judy Meisel, whose World War II experiences inspired a lifelong campaign for civil rights. In 2008, she made Refusenik about the Soviet Jewry movement. And in 2015, she directed Rock in the Road, about a rock and roll band in the southern Israeli town of Sderot. Laura, welcome to Jewish Cinémathèque.
Thank you for having me here.
So it's so nice to be chatting with you. What's it like to be a documentarian? I mean, you went to school, you went to USC for film school after graduating from Stanford, and what pushed you in the direction of making documentary films?
You know, I love documentary films, but I started out wanting to do narrative films, and I still am interested in doing narrative films and dramatic films. But there was something in that time, and I think even now, it was so the ease with which you could just grab a camera and go. You didn't have to wait for a big budget. You didn't have to wait to get greenlit. You didn't have to wait for somebody else to say yes to you. You could, as a student, I mean, I started Talk for Alt, which I made as a collaboration with my 2 very best friends from USC Film School, and we kind of ran off with a camera to Eastern Europe and took this Holocaust survivor to retrace her journey. So it was like an easy way to get started. to tell a story.
And where did your Jewish identity fit into this? Because although not all of your films are necessarily about Jewish life or Jewish culture, it's a clear thread in most of your work.
I don't think that I set out to make Jewish films. I was interested in World War II. I was always interested in stories of people in the underground, people who were activists. And I did study as an undergrad. I did study a good deal about the Shoah and sort of post-war Eastern Europe. And I was interested in my own identity and roots. And it's always just story-based that I will find some story and get into it. And I think I started off with this story of Judy, who was a family friend. And you know, it's like one thing leads to another. You do this successful project about Holocaust turned civil rights activist, and the next thing you know, other stories are falling into your lap that are kind of somehow related, or so it kind of found me, the Jewish storytelling.
So how did Refusenik come into being?
There were some people who saw Talk for Alt at a time that we were premiering this whole educational program with it. We had written a curriculum guide. We had teachers and from the ADL.
It was used in schools all across,
all over the place. And in Omaha, Nebraska, of all places, I worked with these two brilliant curriculum writers, and we wrote this curriculum that could be used for state standards and get this film, and this was so many years ago.
For Holocaust education.
For Holocaust education, but they found a way that you could go to a public school and it would qualify for like an English, it would tick all the boxes, or social studies, or to ways that the film, it was very ingenious, ways that this film could be used in all kinds of different classes. And we sort of unveiled this curriculum with screenings of the film in Omaha in this 1 week with a lot of different school appearances. I think this was 2002. And there were these two men from the Jewish community in Omaha. One of them actually worked for the ADL at that time. And Bobby Wolfson, and they saw the film and they said, "We have your next movie." And I think I at that point was ready to I didn't know how to fundraise anymore, and I mean I was young, and I was like, I'll just go get a job for a producer in Hollywood and figure out what I'm going to do, how I'm going to start my career.
The life of a documentary filmmaker.
But they said, we have a project, and they brought to me there's a woman in Omaha named Shirley Goldstein that was smuggling prayer books under her clothes into Russia, and you have to meet her. There was something about the activism, and Judy was a woman, and Shirley was a woman. I just think they saw something in the film that said, this person needs to make this story. And then they went to Shirley, and they said, Shirley, we found the filmmaker that's going to make your story. And she said, my story, this isn't about me, this is about the Refuseniks and all the activists all over the country. So they basically just dropped this project in my lap, found me funding, and for the beginning, just enough funding to get it started so that I was then completely hooked and obsessed and I couldn't stop, And I started to go around and do these interviews with activists and with Refuseniks, and then it ended up being this huge
traveling all across the world.
All across the world. I was obsessed with finding archives that would document this. I was going through people's garages in the middle of Palmdale in California, and went to the state archives in Russia.
You see, people don't understand what's involved in making a documentary film.
You try to dig up this material, and it became such an obsession. And I'm not done actually with that story. I have some things that I want to do with that
sequel.
Story. Yeah, yes, I'm still not done. That is an amazing story of the Jewish people, but it's also a wider, I think, universal story of what it's like to live in a totalitarian society, how scary it is to speak up, you know, what it's like to live in a controlled, government-controlled
Yes.
situation where you don't have the freedom of speech.
And now, of course, that is back.
That is back in all kinds of places. And so for me, it's an incredibly relevant story, and I'm working on some things.
There's the documentary COP, the thinking. Then you found yourself in Israel, in Sderot, in the south of Israel, making a film about a rock and roll band.
Well,
how did that evolve?
So when I went to Israel to do all these Refusenik interviews, I think it was 2004 or something, I heard those early years of these rocket attacks in Sderot. And I suddenly had all these friends.
For the audience, just to understand, Sderot's in the south of Israel, and it was one of the recipients of many of the rockets that were coming out of Gaza.
It actually is the closest small city to Gaza, and it was the easiest place for terrorists to fire rockets. They could be in this one area and they would know that their rockets would land in a populated area.
And so what, they had like 15, 30 seconds to be able to run to?
15 seconds.
Yeah. To be able to run for cover, the residents.
So I had heard about this, and it was very unknown. Nobody knew about Sderot outside of Israel, and most people in Israel didn't even know that much about it. And I was living in LA, and I was reading the newspapers, and it was like you would only see anything in the newspaper if there was a response from the Israelis. There was almost never a response from the Israelis, but if the rocket fire got to be too intense, sometimes there would be some sort of operation for a couple of days into Gaza, and the next thing you would know would be on the front page of the New York Times.
Right.
And so I said, they're not telling like the other side of the story. Somebody has to tell this side of the story. So I said, well, I want to see what's going on in Sderot. And I started investigating, and I found out that Sderot was sort of like the Seattle of Israel in the 90s. It had all these amazing rock bands that had really changed Israeli music to become more Middle Eastern than it had previously been. And there were these edgy bands from there. And I was like, that's so cool. I want to see what the connection is, you know? And so in 2007, I showed up in Sderot to make a film about musicians living under rocket fire.
Just so that everyone understands, when you say you showed up with your camera, or you had a camera crew, or what?
I had a crew.
You had a crew.
I bring a crew.
Okay.
Usually. So I had a crew. I had sent some researchers ahead to give me the lay of the land. I showed up and I started filming all kinds of young musicians doing music in this situation where they had, 15 seconds, the Seva Adom alarm would start going off, and you'd had 15 seconds to get into a bomb shelter. A lot of the people who died didn't make it into a shelter. There weren't enough shelters. There wasn't a shelter in all the homes in those days. And I found this group of young people working in a underground miklat. A miklat is a bomb shelter that's actually like underground, and it was called Sderot. It was it was like a club for youth called Sderot, and they had like a band set up and a recording set up. And there was this guy who was their sort of counselor who was in charge, and he was a musician himself, Avi Vaknin. So I started interviewing him and what he was doing with the kids. But he said, well, I have my own album. And I decided he should be the main character because his own album, first of all, it was beautiful. The music was amazing, but it really spoke to, he was writing about what it felt like to live there. And that was what I was looking for. So I was like, this is the main character. And he had absolutely no interest in being filmed. He didn't want to be filmed. He tried to not call me back. He didn't. Well, I ended up marrying him.
Oh boy.
Yes. So that film became a personal film.
I guess he did call you back finally.
Oh yeah, finally. So, then I was living in Sderot, and I was experiencing what was happening there on a daily basis, and it just started filming our lives, basically.
That's an incredible story.
It's weird to watch it now.
After October 7th.
It's
yeah.
I don't even have the word for what it feels like to watch it, but it's different.
Let's jump into Vishniac. I mean, it's a fascinating story. I remember those years when the albums, the photographic albums of Eastern European Jewry, Life Has Vanished, and so on and so on.
A Vanished World.
The Vanished World, right. The Vishniac photographs, what he captured. What interested you in that subject?
I had my hometown, Santa Barbara, California, and Mara Vishniac Cohn, Vishniac's daughter, I think she spent the last 40 years of her life living in Santa Barbara, and it's a small Jewish community there. Many, many, many years ago, I was trying to figure out when it was, and then I just found a paper that sort of clued me in. But it was, I think, 1996. A mutual friend of Mara's and mine, this wonderful woman named Pam Tosher, who's an artist, and she was my art teacher, kind of said, I ran into her at this event where Elie Wiesel was speaking, and Mara was there, and she sort of made a shidduch. She said, "You two need to meet each other." And so I was always interested in these stories and interviewing people, and it's just part of who I am. So we ended up sitting together in the front row, waiting for Elie Wiesel to come give his lecture. And Mara starts telling me about her childhood growing up in Berlin as a little Jewish girl whose family was affluent, and she had this great life until the Nazis came to power and she started losing all of her civil rights and what it felt like to suddenly...
She was born, what, in 1926?
1926. And then just the stories of these violent things would happen, the incidents that started happening when the Nazis came to power, and she and her brother would be sent off to relatives, like alone. The mother, her parents would put them on a train and send them to the grandparents in Latvia or the aunt in Sweden in order to protect them, and then they would eventually come, it would die down, and then they would come back, and then things would get worse, and they would go on. They ended up being all separated from each other, and then finally Roman was in France and they were in Sweden, but then they finally got visas to get out, and it was like at the 11th hour in late 1940. They had to, because they were Latvian citizens and Latvia had been taken over by the Soviet Union, there was no way for them to get from Sweden to America without going back through Nazi-occupied Berlin. And I'm like,
we're talking about the late 30s.
No, we're talking about December 1940.
Wow.
And I'm imagining their journey and I was like, this is a movie. I was on the edge of my seat listening to her. And the crazy piece is that I didn't even know who Roman Vishniac was. And I had been a student of photography. I had my own darkroom. I made my own black and white prints. I studied modernist photographers that were contemporaries of Vishniac, like Cartier-Bresson, for example. But Vishniac was never included in that cadre of people. When you're learning about Robert Capa and you're learning about all these, he's not one of the names, And so Mara, after this meeting, invites me and my parents to her home, which you see in the movie. It's like you feel like you're going into another
museum,
universe.
Right.
And with her husband, Walter Cohn, who was a renowned physicist, who ended up winning a Nobel Prize a few years later. And we're sitting there in her home, and she's having tea or whatever, and the photos are on the wall. A Vanished World is there. And I said, "Dad, you have this book in your study." And she goes to this her closet where she kept everything, and she opens the closet, and these like this portfolio kind of falls down, like a box of pictures, and it had Einstein prints inside of it.
Pictures of Einstein.
Pictures of Einstein that her father had photographed. So that was an amazing encounter. And I think, and I was doing other projects. I was always off doing other projects, but there was this thing in the back of my mind that one day this is a movie that I need to make. And I was living, in LA, and then I was living in Israel, and it wasn't until I came back for a time to live in Santa Barbara, and the same friend reintroduced Mara and I and took us out to lunch together, and we started talking about doing a film.
And at that point you said, I must capture this woman. She's no youngster. I must capture her on film.
I just was like, the time was right. It was the right moment, but she did not want to make a film at the beginning. She was very reluctant.
Because?
Because her relationship with her father was very complicated, and he was a complicated person. And I think she neither wanted some hagiographic, heroic, false film about him, and she also didn't want someone to blame him for too much and take away from his, I mean, she was the protector of his legacy, but she also had her own views on him. I think it was really hard for her to trust somebody with the story. And so she said, well, you can't, it's not all great, and I said, but that makes it interesting. Really? Yes, I said, all of these great artists, it's not like they have to be a perfect person to make a film.
And then you had her actually narrate this film.
But you see, like, I had come to the story from her story. And I felt that what she had gone through and her story of what had happened to her in Weimar Berlin, and then Nazi Berlin, and then being, escaping from Europe, and then being an immigrant in America, was also a hugely valuable story to tell. And if she didn't narrate it, what would we have? I mean, she had so much to tell about who her father was and all of the detailed stories that she still sort of tells through the eyes of a child, I think, And
you actually, if you actually sort of, the narrative filmmaker in you, do some recreations of scenes.
Yes, I did not even think about it as recreations. I literally thought, like, this is a movie and I'm making these scenes, and it's really thought about it like a hybrid.
And who did you get to play the young Mara?
Did you already know this?
Who is absolutely delicious in the film. Your daughter.
My daughter Lily Vaknin, and it didn't even occur to me, but Sophie Sartain, our writer, met Lily for the first time when we were first starting to work together. I was working with Sophie and Roberta Grossman and Nancy Spielberg, and Sophie met Lily, and she said, "You have to cast her." I mean, she was the right age. She had she had this look that was. You could not have done better in central casting.
You're in trouble. She's a natural.
I'm in trouble.
Let's just talk a little bit about Vishniac, the person. I mean, here is this individual who decides in the late 30s to go and to photograph Jews on their farms, in their shtetl, in the urban areas, all kinds of Jews. Zionists. He goes and he films them in a hakshara, in an agricultural settlement, preparing to pick up and go. And these photographs are incredible. But how did he live? I realized that at a certain point the Joint Distribution Committee helped fund him.
He came from a very wealthy family, so they owned I think the apartment building that they owned the apartment building they lived in, and
in Russia.
In
Berlin.
In Berlin, he had fled from Russia, from Moscow in 1920, married Luta, who was from Latvia, on the way, and they went to Berlin. And he was living in Weimar, Berlin, and one of the stories that we tell in the film is that his parents he was expected to bourgeois values, expected to run a family business, and they kept trying to start all these businesses for him, and he had no interest in running any kind of business, and so he kept sort of purposefully not doing anything with the businesses, and they all failed. And he wanted to be a scientist. He was obsessed with science.
And he studied in Moscow, did he not?
He studied in Moscow, but he never finished. We don't think he ever really got all of the
Although
degrees.
he claimed to have his doctorate in several degrees, and he was a professor, and he was a doctor, and he was a this and a that. Part of the myth or the legacy that he decided to want to leave.
So he would just, one amazing scholar who unfortunately is no longer with us, but who was brilliant, is David Schneer, talks about Roman being a flaneur. A word that I love, a flaneur. He would take his camera and he would go around in Berlin and just photograph things and observe. And I think that at the beginning, after leaving Moscow, you get the feeling from looking at Vishniac's these modernist photographs of daily life in Berlin, they're not specifically very Jewish. You get the feeling that he was sort of escaping a more insular Jewish community in Moscow where he couldn't really be a part of the mainstream. Here in Weimar, Berlin, he could be a part of the mainstream.
He was an artist.
He could just be an artist like anybody else, and his Jewish identity didn't really come into play. He could shed it, And at a certain point, after 1933, you couldn't do that anymore.
Right.
And he had to start focusing on Jews. And I see there's these photographs that he took of Mara around Berlin with Nazi propaganda posters and Nazi election posters. And it almost feels like an activist sort of photography, like he wants to document this moment in time that this,
if he were to just take pictures of these various posters and whatever, he'd get himself into a lot of trouble.
Right. So he would put Mara in front of the poster, and if some authority came, he said, "Well, I'm just taking a photo of my little girl." The fact that that's in the background, So he did that, and then we don't really have any documentation, but you start seeing that in the photographs themselves that he photographed all of these Jewish organizations in Berlin that were working, like welfare organizations, which became much bigger when things became more difficult for Jews after the Nazis took over.
Right.
So schools and hospitals and all kinds of organizations. Then he has this whole series of amazing photographs of offices run by Jewish organizations where they're trying to help people get visas to escape. And you look at the faces of these people that are sitting at a desk across from somebody, the angst and the fear and the I'm trying to leave, but how am I going to get out?
And he
captures this. Unbelievable. And then he starts doing the Eastern Europe photography. And we don't really know. We know that at some point he was commissioned by the Joint. But we don't really know if he went off first and started photographing, because the only thing that we have is a letter or the minutes of the Joint saying that one of the board members was given these photographs and they're amazing and we want to hire him. So we already had something to show. But you get the feeling that he was someone who, started out very Jewish, had sort of a flirtation with being more universal, and then sort of came back into the Jewish community. And then as he starts documenting life in Jewish life in Eastern Europe, you just can see the photographs become more and more intimate. He's like falling in love with his people. That's how I see the photograph. They start off where he's documenting poverty you know, you can analyze the photographs. They're more distant. They're compositional. He's showing you a frame of Warsaw and its poverty and it's these people working hard. But as he goes deeper and deeper into Eastern Europe, the photographs become more intimate and they become more, he has more of a rapport with the people. He's there amongst them. All of those sort of things are the constructs of him being like separate from them, it kind of falls away.
Yeah, in the film, and we don't have really much more time to delve into this, but in the film you then go on to look at Vishniac, the biological photographer, which is another interesting, fascinating piece, and certainly worthy of everyone watching this movie. The film is called Vishniac. I just, you know, your life and your work is so fascinating. And I also understand that you found yourself returning from a family trip to Europe on October 5th, 2023, and went back to your apartment in Tel Aviv and sent off your kids to Sderot to be with their dad. And 2 days later, there they were in Sderot. So is that going to be potentially your next film? What a terrible, awful situation.
It's a miracle that they're okay, and it's been a very interesting time to live in Israel, and it really feels like one family. And I've been running around filming all kinds of things connected to October 7th. But there was one thing that made me think of Vishniac the other day, which was I went to an exhibit that they had about the Nova party in Tel Aviv. And they had these huge screens. You walk in and they've recreated the stage and the music from the Nova party. And on these big screens, they have the videos that are taken of these beautiful young people dancing at the party. And you're there.
This is the rave festival.
The rave festival. You're there and watching these screens and their faces very close up, not unlike Vishniac photographs, are right there, and you're watching these beautiful people in their last moments, and you can sort of just appreciate their spirit, their smiles, their faces. And it reminded me of Vishniac's photographs because, you know, I don't think of this film as a Holocaust film. I think about it at all. It's not about the Holocaust, it's about the life before. And that's what this exhibit, the Nova exhibit did. It was the life before
October 7th.
The life before, and the lives before, and the people before, and the souls. And it was a very profound moment when I realized that there was a connection between these two things.
The film is Vishniac. Vishniac is going to be shown theatrically across the United States and soon to be streamed on your TV set. Laura, thank you so much for joining us. Much success with this film, and we look forward to many more films to come.
Thank you.
Thank you for being with us.
Thanks.